This October, we are receiving the 13th installment in the Halloween franchise and the final film in the recent Halloween trilogy. As a big fan of the Michael Myers Halloween films, I'm really excited about the new movie, and in preparation for its new release, I decided to marathon all 12 movies. So in today's video, I'm going to be ranking my favorite and least favorite entries in the Halloween franchise.
Stars and Stripes!
Hello and welcome to another Carrot Scraps video, and by another, I mean the 112th. So, like I mentioned, there are 12 entries in the Halloween series, and I literally just finished watching all of them. Like, I just watched Halloween Kills before I flipped on the camera to record. And I gotta say, unlike the previous tier ranking list that I did with Hellraiser, this video is going to be a little bit difficult for me. You see, I love the franchise, but it feels like every time I rewatch one of these movies, my opinion changes. And I either love it or dislike it more than I did the previous time. And I can never really predict which way my brain is going to go. And this recent marathon is no different. So I just wanted to say up front, bear with me if some of my opinions in this video change in the coming years. My recent opinion changes could also have something to do with the fact that I watched 12 of these movies basically in one sitting. I've been very sick over the past week, and I watched these movies for comfort, and so just keep that in mind, that my brain was very much so in a different state while watching all 12 of these in a row. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's focus on the main event and rank all 12 Halloween films. We have a little bit different of a setup this time, I hope you don't mind. Halloween 1978. And without even thinking about it, this is getting an S tier. It's hard to describe how special this movie is to me. I genuinely think it's one of the best horror movies ever made. It sounds obvious, but I also think it's an absolutely perfect movie to watch on Halloween night. And I think it just represents the general anxiety and fear that we experience on Halloween. That while you're trying to enjoy the festivities, there could be something very real and malevolent lurking in your backyard. It's so effortless, it's so perfect, it's so enigmatic, and it's so simple, especially compared to the sequels that get very convoluted, which can definitely be fun in their own way, but I can't help but appreciate how simple the first movie is. Not to mention the music is incredible, the design of the Michael Myers mask is incredible, and the luck and happenstance combined with talent and ingenuity that went into making this movie is just such a perfect storm of creativity. And I don't know what else I can say about it without making my own video, so we're just gonna leave it at that. It's an S tier. Watch Halloween if you haven't. But then we're going to transition into Halloween 2, which is a sequel that takes place immediately after the first one and on the same night. And I gotta say, over the years, I've really loved this movie, but upon my last two rewatches, including the rewatch that I just did before this video, I haven't been enjoying it as much. And it makes me sad because there's a lot that I really do like about this movie, but the worst thing about it is that it's a little slow and it's a little dull. And that feels so disrespectful to a movie that I respect in so many other different ways. What's interesting is I've heard people criticize the first Halloween for things that I criticize Halloween 2 for, but there's something about the first movie that is slow in a good way and that builds up perfectly in my opinion. And for whatever reason in Halloween 2, it just doesn't work the same for me. Maybe it has something to do with the setting, maybe the wait is a little bit longer than the first one, or maybe it's just doing the same thing again. I'm not as into it. But for whatever reason, the last two times I've watched this movie, I've been pretty bored by it, even though I love tons of things about it. I do actually like that it takes place in a hospital, even though I think it's not as scary for most viewers. I personally have a long history with hospitals, so it kind of feeds on this secret insecurity that I have. This is also the movie that introduces the family relation between Michael Myers and Laurie Strode, which I understand why people aren't into, but you can't deny it has been a staple of the series for decades now. And it's a respected part of the canon that a lot of people have trouble not considering when thinking about the franchise, even though it has nothing to do with the first movie. So for now, I'm gonna leave this in B tier. I do like a lot about this movie, but for whatever reason, I do think that it could be a little bit more entertaining, and maybe it could do with a little bit more of a harsher edit next time. So Halloween 2 gets a B tier from me. Now Halloween 3, of course, is infamous for being very disappointing to a lot of Halloween fans. Because of course, it's the first and only Halloween movie that technically doesn't have Michael Myers in it. And that's because the series was planning on doing an anthology where each installment was going to be about a different Halloween story. An idea I actually really like. Even though I'm a big fan of Michael, and even though I still enjoy the other sequels that feature him. But needless to say, this was not received well back in the day, but I gotta say, in recent years, like the past 6 or 7 years, in my opinion, it seems as if horror fans or Halloween fans have accepted this movie again. I see a lot more Halloween 3 Season of the Witch merchandise than I ever have, and I see a lot of people talking about this movie positively. So I think it's finally made its return in public opinion. But what do I think of it? Well, I love this movie. It's definitely far from perfect. It's definitely weird. The acting can be really bad. There are some weird choices in the story that I don't necessarily agree with. But overall, I think it's weird in a lot of good ways too. I think it's such a unique movie. I think, interestingly enough, I think it accomplishes its goal about being a Halloween story. I think it's part of the reason why there's so much merchandise for this film now, because the iconography from the movie is very Halloween. I don't know, if it wasn't for the acting and some of the story choices, I'd be tempted to put this next to Halloween in S tier, because I think similar to the original Halloween, it represents a perfect Halloween story. But because of my technical issues with it, I'm gonna put it in A tier, which is of course still a really great score. I think this is a great movie and one of the best sequels that the series has to offer. And if you've ever been closed-minded to Halloween 3 Season of the Witch because there's no Michael Myers, I'd say give it a second shot and go in with an open mind. The other thing that's amazing about this movie is the soundtrack. I mean, I can't say it enough. I love John Carpenter's music, and I think he did some really cool original things in this soundtrack that separate it from the first two while still having echoes of them. So definitely A tier. And then Michael Myers returned in Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Now again, I feel like people have not been kind to this movie, including myself, but when I rewatched this movie a couple of years ago, I really liked it, to my surprise, and when I rewatched it again for this marathon, I was in love with it. And after giving it some consideration, I can proudly say that I love Halloween 4. Now again, obviously, it's not perfect. One of my biggest criticisms of the movie is that it has one of the worst masks in the franchise. It's just too clean and it's too white. And I was gonna say that it wins the prize for worst mask, but there's actually another contender that takes that position. Plus, for the most part, I feel like there's a reason why this mask is so clean, and that's because he just picked up a new one. Another one of my criticisms is that they changed the Myers house for some reason. I don't know if they just didn't think that people would notice or if they forgot, but it definitely stands out in this movie and the next one. But I like the characters in the movie. I think it really draws you in. I think it's really dramatic. I think it has some really interesting ideas and some really cool scenes. One of my favorite scenes is when Dr. Loomis confronts Michael in the gas station. I think about that scene all the time, and I just think it's really interesting. So a younger me wouldn't believe that I'm about to say this, but I'm gonna say that Halloween 4 gets an A tier. It's a really great movie, and I find myself wanting to watch it more and more all the time. Next up, we have Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers. Now, Halloween 5 flirts more with the supernatural elements with Michael. Up until this point, they've just kind of been hinted at, and I feel like in this movie, more than any other, it's confirmation that there's something more going on with the Myers family and with Michael in general. And it's also a more concrete introduction to the Thorn rune and the Thorn trilogy in general, I suppose. And I gotta say, like Halloween 4, even though back in the day I didn't have the best opinion of this movie, every time I've rewatched it in my adulthood, I've found myself liking it more and more each time, with my most recent watch being my favorite watch of it yet. Now, one of my, I guess, weirder criticisms about this movie is that I think it's a little too morbid sometimes. I know that sounds weird for a movie about a serial killer, but I just feel like I would have liked it if some of Jamie's family or friends survived at the end, because it's just kind of a depressing ending. I feel like at the end of a Halloween movie, you need to either definitively kill, quote unquote, Michael and have your friends dead, or survive with your friends and know that he's alive somewhere, because otherwise it's just a downer ending. It doesn't feel the best to get to the end of a movie and be like, great, I survived, but everyone I know is dead and Michael is still alive, so he's gonna come get me someday. It doesn't feel the best, but that's kind of a nitpick, because in general, I really love this movie. Again, I really like the characters in this movie. I know a lot of people are bothered by the supporting cast in this movie, but I am not. And again, I think it's a very captivating Michael Myers film and a movie that I would love to watch on Halloween night. I think it really sets the mood well. And so it's getting an A tier. Then we have Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, which is technically when they stopped numbering the movies. And this movie breaks the trend, because this movie I really disliked. I knew it was going to come eventually. I couldn't have a positive opinion of all the Halloween movies, but I really disliked this movie. This movie was kind of a slog to get through, honestly. You know, I like Paul Rudd as an actor, but there's something about him in this movie that really bothers me. I don't know if it's because he's so famous of an actor that when I see him, I don't see a character, I just see Paul Rudd, or if it's his directing, because the performance he gives in this movie is not something I enjoy in the least. People talk about annoying support characters in the Halloween franchise, and I don't see that in other movies the way that I do in Paul Rudd in this movie. No offense to Paul Rudd. Again, I feel like it has to be the directing, because I get he's supposed to be a little weird and a little odd, but it was just so not fun to watch him do anything in this film. Now, this movie also explores the supernatural elements of Michael Myers to a further extent, going beyond vague suggestions and giving it concrete lore. And again, in general, I do like a more simple Michael Myers. I do prefer the original, where it's just a guy on the loose who's a little mysterious, and sure, he could survive those gunshot wounds, but maybe somebody could. Sure, he's weird, but in your heart you know that he's just a guy, and he's a weird guy, but he's still a dangerous guy. So I've never really been into the supernatural side of Michael Myers. But that being said, I'm not necessarily against what the Thorn trilogy was trying to do. And again, maybe it's my age showing, or maybe it's because I watched all 12 of these in a row, but I actually didn't mind the lore and kind of liked the idea of tying Michael Myers to a cult. As long as he was still this simplistic murder machine, this unstoppable force, this evil, I didn't necessarily mind them delving into the more nitty-gritty details about him. That being said, my problem with this movie isn't the ideas, it's the execution. I think in a different movie they could have done this stuff way better, but this film, in my opinion, is not made very well. It's weird, it's boring, it doesn't have sympathetic characters, and I just didn't have the best time watching it. It felt like it was missing a lot of the details that made a Michael Myers movie fun for me. So this is going straight into D tier. I wonder who could surround the other two. Also, we upgraded. We have an F tier now. I figured out how to do that. Then, of course, we have the 7th installment in the series, Halloween H2O 20 Years Later. That is the full title. That is a strange title, but that is a full title. And this is a movie that may or may not retcon the other sequels after 2, but either way, it takes place after Halloween 2 and makes it clear that Laurie Strode faked her death, but 20 years later as an adult, she's still afraid of the legacy of Michael Myers. And even though he burned to death, she's anxious that he will return to kill her. And exploring her romantic relationship and her relationship with her family is a big part of this movie. And I gotta say, this movie is absolutely awesome. I rewatched this maybe 2 years ago, and I was expecting not to like it. I think I've gotten too into making fun of the name because it's a very silly name. But when I rewatched it, I was like, that was awesome. And again, after rewatching it, I continue to think that it's awesome. I think it does a really good job at being a traditional Michael Myers horror movie. I think they do a good job of depicting Michael and the fear he represents. But also, I think they do a great job with Laurie Strode. Her character, the way that she performs, and her arcs are really interesting. I think Jamie Lee Curtis does an incredible job in this movie, potentially one of my favorite performances from her throughout the whole series. I love how proactive she is towards the end, and I love how much of a sacrifice it is for her to overcome her personal fears and to use her knowledge of Michael and the lore surrounding him to overcome the threat that he represents. Ironically enough, this movie reminds me of Scream in a lot of ways, where I feel like Laurie is very aware of the tropes that surround Michael. And all of the stuff that you hear people scream at the screen in the previous sequels, it's like Laurie knows and she's trying to act on it before it happens. And I thought that was done really well and really masterfully. It's an awesome movie, it's a fun movie, and it's occasionally a scary movie. One criticism that I do have of H2O, though, is that it does win the worst mask in the series. It was almost 4, but H2O really gave 4 a run for its money. The hair is really weird on the mask in this one. It also feels way too tight, and worst of all, you can see Michael's eyes, which I just don't think you should be able to see Michael's eyes. That seems like a bad idea. So definitely wins worst mask in the series, even though it's an awesome movie. And I'm giving this an A tier. Again, another incredible sequel. Again, I have to highlight, a younger me would not have thought that all of these movies would be A tier. And not for nothing, without thinking about it, I've talked about a while recently, like, oh, Michael Myers doesn't have the best sequels. But looking at this now, like, what was I talking about? Like, come on, Carrot, give this series more credit. It deserves it. Coming up next, we have Halloween 8, aka Halloween Resurrection. And this movie gets an F. All right, I wanted to get that out of the way because I have a lot to say about this one. Now, Halloween Resurrection kind of took me by surprise in my recent marathon, especially because, I had so many changes of heart and changes of opinion when it came to rewatching a lot of these movies. So I was hoping that I would like this movie more, and I didn't. I just didn't like it. Now, I will say, I dislike it very strongly for biased reasons. Spoilers for the very start of the movie, but this movie not only murders Laurie Strode in a bizarre and kind of gross way, in my opinion. In fact, a very gross way, in my opinion. But on top of that, it takes the amazing and proactive ending of H2O and retcons it so that way it makes Laurie look stupid. And honestly, as a comic book fan, it's one of the worst retcons I've seen in a while. Not gonna say ever, because that's just not true. And so, in my opinion, it just presents something really dumb, and then it makes Laurie look dumb, and then they make Laurie die, and she dies in an embarrassing and awful and gross way. And watching it, I was not happy. I was not having a good time. I guess I forgot about this, like I just blocked it out of my head, but I certainly remember it now, and I vow never to forget it, because I hate it. I hate the opening of this movie. It's awful. But that being said, let's judge the movie for more than just the opening, right? Beyond that opening sequence, the rest of the movie is okay, I guess. The rest of the movie kind of does what Hellraiser Hellworld does, which is take an existing horror franchise and put the internet in it, and suddenly you have a good movie. And I'll admit, again, as a fan of found footage horror, I was kind of on board with the concept and the idea, but it was just a little generic. I liked some of the actors in the movie, but overall the characters felt very bland. I didn't really feel myself connecting to any of them, and so as a result, it wasn't interesting to see, you know, what they did and whether they survived. And in general, it just felt like a very dull entry in the franchise. And then combine that dullness with one of the worst openings in any movie ever, because not only do they take the time to like disrespect a fan favorite character and humiliate her, but also it was unnecessary. I understand that Michael was decapitated in Halloween 7, but like, who cares? I don't think you needed to retcon the series and kill Laurie to explain how he came back from the dead. I mean, the movie's called Resurrection, like, and there was no resurrecting in it. The opening of the movie really has nothing to do with the rest of the film other than to explain how Halloween 7 and Halloween 8 are connected. And I just couldn't care less. I don't know if this is a controversial take, but in my opinion, Michael Myers has like a healing factor. Maybe it's slower than Wolverine's, but it's kind of like Wolverine's. And so from my perspective, when I'm watching these movies, when Michael gets shot in the eyeballs or stabbed in the eyeballs or you know, anything happens to his eyeballs, essentially over time he will heal and get better, kind of like the way that he does in Halloween 5. And so even though it would have taken some extra logic to understand why Michael got his head back, I would have accepted a lot before I would have wanted to see Laurie Strode murdered in such an awful way. Anyway, less said about Halloween Resurrection, the better. I do like a lot about it. I actually really like Busta Rhymes in the movie. I think he did a good job, even beyond his very silly martial arts. And again, I like the idea, you know, people going into Michael's territory and being attacked by him and, you know, streaming that footage out to an audience. I like a lot of those ideas, but they didn't do the work to endear me to these characters. It wasn't an interesting movie to watch, and it started with a really bad taste in my mouth, and especially for a sequel, like that's important for you not to do that. So in general, I really dislike, you know, Halloween Resurrection. Then the continuity ends. And if, you know, depending on who you ask, the continuity ended earlier, but the continuity ends definitively right there. And we get Rob Zombie's remake slash prequel, Halloween 2007. And I'm going to drop this in C tier immediately. And I wanted to say, basically, I like this movie a lot, actually. I think it's a pretty good film. I think it's really well made. I think it does something new with the franchise, which is really important for long-running franchises like this. I like Rob Zombie. I think he has an interesting take on filmmaking. It's clear that he's passionate about this character. And again, I think it's a well-made film. But the reason it's in C tier instead of higher up is because I just feel like it's not my kind of movie. Or at the very least, it's not what I come to a Michael Myers film for. It's just a little too intense for my liking. It lacks a fun that the other movies have. I know that sounds incredibly disrespectful and morbid that I'm implying there's a fun to these serial killer movies, but there kind of is. You know, you watch Friday the 13th, you watch Nightmare on Elm Street, you watch Halloween for the kind of fun of following these Halloween monsters. And while there's definitely something interesting about taking a more quote-unquote realistic, or probably more appropriately like darker approach to Halloween in this movie, it's not necessarily what I want to watch every year. You know, for example, I could watch A tier over and over for a couple of days straight without getting tired of it. But Halloween 2007 I'm probably good on one watch of that a year. Again, great movie, just not necessarily what I am looking for from a Michael Myers film. And again, it's also got some weird moments for me, especially like in the script writing. I think there are just some odd moments that I would have edited out. But overall, I think it's a well-made film. I think it adds something interesting to the franchise. It shows us some new stuff, and it has a very interesting approach to the filmmaking. So it's getting a C tier because I think it's a pretty good movie, but it's just not my speed. So I'm sure you're curious, what do I think of Halloween 2? 2009's Rob Zombie sequel. I'm going to give this a C tier as well. It's very interesting because I've seen a lot of people put this at the bottom of their Halloween ranking list. A lot of people apparently hate this movie, and I gotta be honest, I actually really liked this movie. I've probably seen this Halloween 2 less than any of these movies, so keep that in mind while I talk about it. But I really liked the conceptual, bizarre, and abstract nature of this. Again, I thought it was a very new approach to Michael Myers and Halloween, and again, I think it's something you need with a long-running franchise. And also, I feel like that's a particular strength of Rob Zombie, and it's a strength that I've admired about his work in the past. One of my favorite movies of his is The Lords of Salem, and while I don't love the entire movie, and while I'd never say it's an amazing film, I really like the more abstract aspects of it. And I see the DNA of that in this movie, which I really liked. Again, it's just so out there conceptually, and I love that it blurs these two worlds of Michael's mind and magic and reality to the point where you don't really know what's happening, but you also kind of have a better understanding of Michael and this world, but also you don't at the same time. I don't know, I really like that stuff, and there's also a part of me that feels like I'll be thinking about those ideas presented in this film while I'm watching the other films. So I'm sure you're wondering, if I liked it, why did I put it in C tier? And the reason for that being, I don't think this is the best movie ever made. I really don't think it's a great film. I just like some of the choices that were made in it, and I think the choices that were made in it are really interesting and really cool. But that being said, I don't think it's as good of a film as 2007. So 2007 isn't really my style, but it's a really good movie, and 2009 is my style in some ways anyway, but isn't as good of a movie. I also like hobo hooded Michael Myers in this movie. I thought it was very cool, but that being said, I was kind of disappointed we didn't get to see more of the masked Michael Myers in this film. The soundtrack missing was something I disliked back in the day, but when I rewatched it, I actually didn't mind it, and you know, when the theme came at the end, I was excited, so that didn't bother me very much. I'm not a big fan of what they did with Loomis in this film. It is new, so that's kind of interesting, but overall, I just wasn't really into that. And I also like that they touched on Laurie's therapy, although I wish they did more of that, because I think that's one of the strengths of 2007, is that it fills in the gaps that the original has, where it says, let's explore these story details that we never got to in the original movie, such as what happened during Michael's therapy. So anyway, Halloween 2 is super weird. You know, the stuff with the white horse is really bizarre, very out there, but I like it a lot. I think it's very interesting and very cool. And so it gets a C tier. And then we get to the true resurrection of this franchise. After almost 10 years of no Halloween and more years without a more traditional Michael, we finally get another entry in the series. And this, of course, is Halloween 2018, and as I'm sure you know, it doesn't take most of the Michael Myers sequels as canon. This film actually takes place after the first Halloween, and all of the other sequels, including 2 all the way to Resurrection, are not canon, which is a very interesting approach, but also a more expected approach these days with movies. I feel like a lot of films are doing this. And after watching all 12 of these in a row, I've affectionately started calling Halloween 2018 H4O, because in a lot of ways, it is very, very similar to H2O. It is a movie about the fact that Michael Myers came back to Haddonfield a certain amount of years ago, certain amount of decades ago, and what Laurie Strode has done and how she feels about that. It's kind of wild how similar these two movies are. So I'm going to start calling it H4O, and I hope you do too. But anyway, while this movie and H2O do share a lot of similarities, it's actually very different. And while those similarities are pretty obvious, it's hard to say that they're the same movie at all. First of all, because it takes place after the first movie instead of after the second one, so Michael being related to Laurie Strode is not a part of this film. And also because it's been a longer amount of time, and Laurie has dealt with that night differently in this film than she did in H2O. She raised her kids similarly, but very different as well. And so even though this story is similar, I think it provides a very different experience. And so when comparing H2O to Halloween 2018, I think one of the biggest qualities that 2018 has over its predecessor is style. I think 2018 is so stylistically interesting and is so visually fun to look at in a way that I just don't think H2O is. I think H2O is filmed very functionally. They get the shots that they need to tell the story, and they don't really get very creative with it, in my opinion. Whereas Halloween 2018 gets very creative with its shots, and honestly has a lot of set design and shot design and cinematography that I remember often when thinking about the franchise. So there's a lot of really good things about this movie. But that being said, I also have a lot of issues with this movie. When I first watched this movie, I actually liked it a lot, and I was going into rewatching it expecting it to be an A tier. But one of the biggest things holding it back, in my opinion, is its approach to continuity. And putting aside the fact that I wish all of these movies were still canon, which, you know, is something that I feel. My problem isn't with that, it's more so with the canon it's trying to sell me. Because even when I accept the logic that the film is presenting, I feel like there are still minor continuity errors that hold me back from enjoying the full movie. For example, when the mask is presented to Michael at the beginning of the film, I just feel like that's a really odd moment, because Michael has worn that mask once, 40 years ago. Michael wore that mask one time, 40 years ago. At that point, shouldn't the clown mask have just as much significance? And yet the podcast / journalist who presents the mask to Michael is acting as if it's this big dramatic thing. And he's screaming about how he knows that Michael has a connection to it, and he even mentions it to Laurie. And accepting the logic of the movie that this takes place after the first movie and not the second one, he didn't do that much wearing this mask. Putting his original attack in the clown costume combined with his second attack wearing the Shatner mask, I would just say he has affinity for masks, not an affinity for this mask in particular. There's also the approach to Laurie that I think is really odd, where they talk about them being two sides of the same coin, and they even mention that they're not related, so it makes me wonder, like, why do they think that Michael has this affinity for Laurie? Because in the original film, I mean, he doesn't. In the original film, he's going home, and then he kills anybody who's around. The only reason he went after Laurie specifically was because she got away. In that original film, I don't feel he's targeting Laurie Strode. I feel like he's trying to kill her because she hasn't died yet. But in this movie, not only do they approach Laurie, the victim of an attempted murder by a serial killer, as this like incomplete part of this puzzle, but they also like taunt her by calling him the boogeyman, which, like, dude, super inappropriate. Like, this was just one murder, and it was like just one guy who was really crazy. There was no prolonged searching for Laurie. In addition, I feel like Laurie's reaction to the whole night of having this murder house and having all these weapons is more so in response to like the rest of the franchise, like seeing that Michael doesn't die and that he can be burned alive or decapitated and he'll still come back, and so she has to weaponize herself and her family. Whereas, sure, on the original night, he definitely did present some strange invulnerability, but I just feel like there's a disconnect there. But I'm willing to buy it for Laurie. I'm willing to accept that that traumatic event caused her to be so prepared and paranoid. But I hope you understand, like, there's just a lot to the rest of the film that feels like it's not even following its own lore. But all of that being said, I still think this is a really well-made film. Even if I ignore those, you know, minor lore inconsistencies, I think it's really well made. I think it's really interesting. It's not boring at all. It's very kinetic. It's very visually fascinating. I think this is a really well-made film, and I'm going to put this right into B tier. And now we've arrived at the final Michael Myers film before Halloween Ends comes out this October. And that is the second in the modern trilogy, Halloween Kills. Now, Halloween Kills is going to be a difficult one for me to talk about, because when I first watched this movie, I was extremely disappointed by it. I tweeted out immediately after watching it this: just watched Halloween Kills and it was awful. Like, potentially the worst Halloween film, possibly one of the worst films I've ever seen. It was very bad. I need some time to process this information, LOL. Now, I try to be as careful as I can with my words, so I remember writing that and being like, is this overreacting? And I wasn't sure, and that's why I said, like, I need time to process this. But I was very excited for this movie, and I was apparently very disappointed when I first watched it. But that being said, when I rewatched it just now, and I just rewatched it and started recording, I actually kind of liked this movie. It's really hard for me to say because I remember having such a strong reaction to it, and it's not like it's a perfect or super interesting movie, but I mean, I thought it was fine. So I'm really confused on how to rank this. I potentially need more time with this. I know I said I watched Halloween 2 the least, but I feel like Halloween Kills is the real answer to that. I really haven't seen Halloween Kills that much, and I haven't seen the extended cut, so it's possible that after I see that, I'll like it even more. But I've seen the theatrical cut twice now, and I really hated it the first time I watched it, and the second time I watched it, I thought it was fine. So I don't know what's going on here. What I will say unapologetically that I absolutely love about this movie is the soundtrack. I honestly think of all of the movies, Halloween Kills soundtrack stood out to me the most as something that was carrying on the tradition of the John Carpenter score while still doing something new and unique. A lot of the tracks in this movie felt really different while not feeling out of place, and I liked that a lot. I also really liked the flashback sequences, especially because of the lighting. I think the lighting was really cool. I didn't like that people kept saying that this was the middle of a trilogy and that's why it wasn't as good back when it first came out, but now I kind of understand what they mean. I like the whole idea of Michael looking out the window and it being mysterious and not knowing exactly why he does that. I will say that I think the whole message about mob mentality is a little heavy-handed and a little over the top, and I'll say that a lot of the acting isn't the best in my opinion. Plus, I don't like a lot of the retreading because it's another Halloween sequel that takes place in a hospital, which I think is funny. But I gotta say, I am very torn on this movie. I'm sorry I can't give you a more definitive answer. I guess 1 year wasn't enough for me. I need to watch it again. I need more time because apparently I either really dislike this movie or I think it's fine. But for now, until I can figure that out, I'm gonna put it in C tier, so that way it kind of sits in the middle of the whole franchise. And with that, you have my Halloween franchise tier list. Like I've said already, I didn't expect to have so many of these sequels so high on the list, and I didn't expect my opinion to change on so many of these movies. At the end of the day, I really love this franchise, and for the most part, I feel like I can rewatch these movies and have a great time. I really think there's something about the Halloween franchise that represents the holiday perfectly. And so on Halloween night, at least for now, from B tier and up, there's no movie I'd rather be watching than Halloween. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. If for some reason you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel for more. As regular viewers know, I make a variety of content on my channel, and I'm always gonna make the videos that I wanna make, but if you see something you enjoy, make sure to let me know, and I'll try to prioritize that kind of content in the future. If you wanna watch me play video games like Back 4 Blood and Evil Dead Live, you can check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/carrotscraps. And all my other social media, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are at carrotscraps as well. So I wanna thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Michael!